Hello and welcome to State Matters. I'm your host, Matt Muratore. June 1st, 2019, after over 45 years in operation, the Pilgrim nuclear power plant will be closing. Soon after the closing was announced, Governor Baker formed a state commission called the Nuclear Decommissioning Citizens Advisory Panel. Joining us to discuss what the closing means to the town of Plymouth and surrounding communities, including Cape Cod and the islands, and frankly, the entire Commonwealth, is the chair of the commission, Sean Mullen. Sean, thanks for joining me today. And thank you so much for actually being on that commission and actually leading that commission. I mean, it means a lot to, as a Plymouth, obviously a Plymouth resident that hosts the power plant, and you being a Plymouth resident as well, it means a lot, to our community that you're actually stepped up and done that. So we appreciate that.
Well, thank you, and you deserve a little of the credit here, because if it were not for your leadership, along with Senator DiMacedo, and quite frankly, the entire bipartisan delegation from the entire South Shore, the Cape, and the islands, the commission, the panel wouldn't exist.
Right. Yeah.
And that was very, very well done. So.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Well, we always start off our show trying to learn who our guest was. And I got your resume. It's a very detailed resume. But briefly tell us, who was Sean Mullen and where you come from, where you grew up, and all that?
Grew up in Boston. Grew up in a great neighborhood called Mission Hill in Boston. Spent the bulk of my youth there, and then went to work for the city of Boston for Kevin White. Ultimately worked.
What did you do with Kevin White?
I was the head of their juvenile justice delinquency prevention programs. In the end, I started out as a street worker, and during the busing crisis in the mid-'70s, working with kids in their neighborhood, trying to figure out how we could diffuse problems before they developed. Worked my way up and ended up becoming the head of the diversion program for the city, trying to get kids out of the criminal justice system, give them a second shot with programmatic and services around it, rather than perhaps getting into a life of real trouble. Then I went to work, did the same thing for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, went to work for the governor of the Commonwealth. And
who was the governor at the time?
Ed King was the governor. Yeah. Got involved in a little of the politics of it at the time, and then opened up a consulting firm on Beacon Hill for a couple of years, and then my wife and I decided to move to Plymouth. She was originally from Weymouth, I was from Mission Hill, and Plymouth was paradise, so we moved to Plymouth.
And you notice I introduced you as Sean Mullen and not Mr. Monica Mullen.
Yeah, I prefer the latter. Monica is wonderful.
For those of you at home that don't know, Monica Mullen is the Chief of Staff for Senator DiMacedo, and prior to that, she was with Senator Therese Murray, and she's stationed out of Portage Park here in Plymouth. So
it's wonderful to live in her shadow.
Yeah, I bet.
It really is. She's wonderful.
I bet. So what do you do now?
I run a high-tech firm, primarily. Again, it's still in the criminal justice industry. The technology that we developed right here in Manomet is used all around the world. It's iris biometrics primarily. We identify individuals by the unique features in the human eye. The human eye is actually significantly more accurate than your fingerprints, for example. You don't leave a copy of it on a weapon or a door or a surface, so it can't be used as criminal evidence after the fact. But it's a great technology for identifying who you have in front of you. So we're installed in 47 states across the country. I've patented 5 different biometric technologies that are unique to our company, but it's all been developed right here in Manomet, so I'm very proud of that.
That's great. That's great. And we love Monica too.
Thank you.
Do. She does a great director.
So do I.
So let's get into the Nuclear Decommissioning Citizens Advisory Panel, which is a mouthful, NDCAP. Is what we fondly call it. Yeah, you're right. Senator DiMacedo and I got together when we first heard the announcement about the power plant closing, that we really need to do something to not just protect the town of Plymouth and the surrounding areas, but the Commonwealth as well. And it's one of those things that over the years, I've been involved with this almost 15 years now, the senator longer, but it's one of those things that you learn over time that there's not a lot of control you have over a nuclear power plant as a community or as a Commonwealth. So we knew we had to bring that message to the governor and say, look, there's a reason you need to get involved with this. There's a reason we need to do this commission. And the initial response, not so much from the governor, from the staff though, was, well, it's all federal. And that's the common answer we heard for years, it's all federal. But we knew there was a slight opening that if we formed a commission, the governor formed a commission, then we'd have some say in the decommissioning, the closure, prior to closure and after closure as well. So, we were very happy that the governor did that. The commission seats how many members does the commission seat?
21 members.
21 members, and I believe, if I'm correct, 6 of those 21 are from Plymouth?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and you being the co-chair.
Yeah, the chair this year.
The chair this year, okay. Did Schwartz step down?
Yeah, he stepped down.
Okay, great.
Couldn't take the pressure.
And you folks have been in existence for almost 2 years now?
Almost 2 years
Almost
come
2 years
June.
now, yeah. So, for those folks at home, I set up the scenario saying, the power plant will be closed on June 1st, 2019. Why don't you, in your own words, tell us why you think the commission was important to set up, and what have you done, before we get into what's going to happen, what have you done to this point?
Well, as you know, the panel got started about 2 years ago, and the primary purpose at first was to understand the complexity of all the issues, because you're absolutely right. Most people at the state government level, because we are not set up like other states, most recently like Vermont, where in Vermont, the Department of Public Utilities has a statutory and legal role in the regulation of the nuclear plant. No such thing exists here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Now, there's another 60 of these plants around the country who are going to go through this same process over time. And most of them all rely on the NRC to regulate
the Regulatory Commission out of Washington.
Thank you for clarifying. They rely on them, and we have had I don't think anybody would argue that we've had a spotty record with the NRC. Many of the opponents of the facility and the operation for the last 40 years have long criticized the NRC for failing, in their opinion, to regulate it properly. The state, on the other hand, and both the executive and some of the constitutional officers have felt they didn't have the statutory basis. So I think you and Senator DiMacedo and the other members of the delegation were exactly right, that there was an opening, because this is a dialogue in the public space. This isn't simply about just regulations and bureaucratic policies, procedures. It's not just about that. This is about real families. This is about communities. This is about real dangers that exist in the community. So the panel spent the first 8-9 months really investigating, learning, and we had multiple speakers, internationally and nationally recognized experts in various fields, from radiology to environmental. We had them come in and explain to us from their perspective what they thought, as well as having the Nuclear Regulatory Commission come in a couple of times, most recently again at our last meeting, to discuss what is the decommissioning process. It is a very complicated, complex process. But I think your point to begin with is the best, which is that no matter what we think, no matter our passions or our inclinations or anything like that, come June 1, this plant will no longer be producing power. And at that point, it shifts over to a different part of its life cycle, which will be the decommissioning. And the question then is, no matter what anybody would wish, for the foreseeable future, the town of Plymouth, that beautiful, pristine location on Cape Cod Bay, is going to be a de facto nuclear waste site. We have got to be prepared to do the right thing by not only the community, but by the region. This is serious stuff.
Yeah. Talk about the NRC a little bit, too, the setup of the NRC.
The NRC is really divided up into blocks of areas of responsibility. So when the plant closes, it goes from an operational oversight to a decommissioning oversight. There are separate sets of regulations. In fact, they've been working on a new set of the decommissioning regulations for years. And we hope within the next year or two that they'll have a new set. But what
There's only been a handful in the country that have ever closed.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
And so it's relatively new.
And they're learning as they go. I don't think anybody, even at the NRC, would argue that they had all of this figured out and fleshed out beforehand. And one of the amazing things, when you can look in the rearview mirror and say, well, how didn't we know this 40 years ago? Well, the offer of carbon-free energy, the offer of being able to produce this clean, and I put that in quotes, energy, was very attractive.
It is the cleanest form of energy, though.
Until you have to deal with
The end
nuclear
results.
spent fuel, which only has a shelf life of 30, 60 million years. I mean, there's a problem. So 60,000, I should say. It's a problem. So they're divided up into buckets. And what we've been doing is transitioning from the operational people, because the panel has no authority, oversight, or anything on the operations. What it's been created to do was look at and help with advising the government on how to deal with the decommissioning. What do we do once the electricity stops? Once the reactor gets shut down, what's the best way to handle it? So that's what we've been focusing on.
And you came up with some recommendations
We did.
for the governor last summer.
Yep.
Talk about how that was developed and what were some of those recommendations.
It was contentious. We ultimately came up with a very detailed report that a lot of very important but very detailed recommendations were left on the table for the first report. At a high level, I think the best way to characterize it is there were about 15 recommendations that, again, the legislative delegation helped take the leadership on this. The Board of Selectmen unanimously adopted them to give guidance to the state to say, look, these are the 15 big ones, because you can't do everything. Some of them you don't really have any role in, but some of them there's a big role, and I'll just pick on one instance. The amount of residual radiation that is going to be allowed after the plant is decommissioned. Now, with the takedown facilities, there's two basic approaches to this. One is called safe store, where you basically shut the place down, take the fuel out of the spent fuel pool when it cools down enough, put it in dry cask storage, keep an eye on the dry cask storage, and it just sits there for up to 60 years.
Including the buildings.
Including the buildings. That's no good for anybody. There's cost. You're draining the decommissioning trust fund, which for Plymouth now is a little over $1 billion. It's being used for this decommissioning, but it's safe store. The other is called decon, or decommissioning. Now, what Entergy has proposed, and I think this is a welcome proposal, is to sell the facility, sell the whole thing, including the land, and this is a very contentious issue, to a newly formed company that in primary corporate structure is one of the most well-known, well-established companies for dry cask storage in the world. It's called Holtec, primarily based out of New Jersey. Company has the capabilities without any reservation to store the stuff. What Holtec has done is they've put together a new corporate structure, bringing in engineering, construction, and decommissioning capabilities of other firms, SNC Lavalin being one of them. They have made a proposal, Entergy and they have gotten together. They've both petitioned the NRC. They've applied for a transfer of the license, not a transfer of the operating license, but a transfer of the license to control the nuclear materials after it shuts down. And they've laid out a plan to decommission the site and to bring it back to basically full use for any purpose in about 8 to 10 years. But there's a lot of questions. There really are a lot of questions. And one of the ones I was going to mention is, what's the residual nuclear radiation that'll be on the site? And there's much talk about the difference between the NRC says that they would allow 25 millirems, or million parts, of radioactive material for exposure over the course of the year on the site. That's the NRC's requirement.
25?
25 millirems.
Yeah.
I think it's broadly felt, I certainly have this opinion, that we should get it down to 10 millirems or below. Now, the Massachusetts Department of Public Health agrees, and they have actually taken steps in the Massachusetts regulations, where we do have some teeth in this, to get that done. But the overarching is, this is just one of many, many issues. There's environmental issues. I don't think anybody would dispute, especially for us who are blessed to live here on the coast. The tides are rising. Water levels are rising. The intensity of storms seems to be increasing. The placement of where this storage will be held, from both an elevation and both a distance back from the water, is critical. There are these kinds of environmental issues. There's issues relating to emergency preparedness. What happens if one of these casks crack? How do our first responders respond to such a thing? There's environmental monitoring. What if there's leakage of radiation into the air? Who's keeping track of that? There are a whole host of things related to this. And then there are some very important things for the local community. For me, I'm an old labor union guy. It starts with the jobs. These are our neighbors. These are people who have been so vitally important to our community. We got to make sure, to the greatest extent we can, that Holtec and Entergy takes care of these employees. That's important. But there's also things like there's 1,500 plus acres of land. This land is not just to say, well, we'll sell it off. No, 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 no. That's not part of the plan here, guys. So there are a number of these types of non-nuclear issues that also have to be dealt with.
And why can't they sell the land?
Well, it's a complicated issue again, but they probably would like to just sell the land for a handsome profit. Well, I don't know that that's in the public's best interest. I think it's worth a discussion. I think it, from a working as a partner in the community, it would be in both Entergy now and Holtec soon, probably, best interest to sit down with the Commonwealth and with the, particularly with the town in this case, and say, what would you like to do with the land? To work as partners. So this is not just an easy transaction, because what people don't understand, Representative, is that every dime involved in this process, every dime, was paid for by the ratepayers. These are taxpayers' dollars. You paid for this already.
Can you explain how that worked, too?
Wow.
Because I don't think a lot of people realize that, and we're still paying for it.
Oh, it's a little complicated. But when the facilities, back in the Boston Edison days, there was a very small charge attached to every single electric bill that funded what was called the Decommissioning Trust Fund. And it was intended, as we now are getting to it, and this is happening again, 60 sites more over across the country, to build up a fund locally so that that fund would be available when the plant shut down to then do what we're about to do now, which is decommission. The ratepayers paid that.
And they're still paying it.
Still paying it. Now, on a national level, and this is where it gets even more complicated, same thing happened, except the federal courts a number of years ago said, well, you guys were supposed to have built a national repository. In this case, it was going to be Yucca Mountain, which of course didn't happen. Yucca Mountain probably cost about the same as the Big Dig, except it's never going to be used for anything because there was a political dispute about this out in Nevada. So now this money is there. So if you think about this from a, the reality of what's on the ground, this company Holtec and Entergy have gotten together with no public bid, although $1 billion of public money is going to be spent on it, that they would
just
argue,
for Plymouth.
Just for Plymouth. Now there's $35 billion on the federal side, and that's another story. But just in Plymouth, there's been no public bid. Entergy got together with Holtec and said, we want to work this out. Entergy correctly, I think, said, we're not in the business of decommissioning. We do energy. That's what we do. We better go find somebody. And they found a good company to do it. Every company at this level has some issues, and Holtec has some issues, but they're a very reputable company for this kind of thing. But they're breaking into a new business. But they're walking into a $1 billion transaction just here. Now there's 58, 59 more of these to come. In addition to that, Holtec is doing some other interesting things, one of which is to try to create a new interim national repository in New Mexico. So they've also got a petition before the NRC asking to be licensed to do that. And the idea would be, of course, and I call this the 3 bites at the apple, first they will get a lot of money, hundreds of millions of dollars, to construct these new casks and store this material. Again, that'll be paid for with taxpayers' dollars out of the Department of Energy's Judicial Awards Fund. It won't come out of the $35 million. So they're going to get that. There's no doubt about that. They will get reimbursed for that money by the federal court. Now, they may not get dollar for dollar, but they'll do very well on it. Then they're going to get the second chunk of this money, the $1 billion, and they're going to get that because the NRC is most likely, barring any surprises, going to approve that transaction to transfer the license ownership and responsibility for the materials to Holtec from Entergy. And at that point, Entergy will say, thanks very much, it's been a wonderful experience, we're on our way. But Holtec will now have the responsibility to clean it up. But they'll have a pretty good deposit. Now, this is a company that doesn't exist today. It's going to be a new limited liability company, often referred to as an LLC, with no other assets except the $1 billion that drops into their account. No bid, no oversight, no disclosures. Not a bad deal if you can get it from a business model, particularly if you can then replicate this and prove out that you can do this successfully. You've got another approximately $75 billion already in the bank from other ratepayers locally waiting for you to come check. And then the third piece, of course, and it's a legitimate enticement, is that if the NRC approves them as an interim storage facility before the feds get their act together and finally build a real one, well, Entergy and Holtec are saying, well, you know, maybe in a half dozen years or so, we can move this material from Plymouth to this new interim storage facility if we get approved by the NRC and if everything works out. So the ideal situation is, yeah, live up to the promise that the federal government did all those years ago. I mean, President Reagan signed it. Live up to the promise of that and say, okay, the material's now spent. We're going to move it away from the location. And after we clean up from the dirt up, you'll finally have your community back. So it gets real complicated.
Yeah. Well, you know, as I said, I've been learning about this since I got involved in the town of Plymouth back in 2005. Spent some time with the Nuclear Matters Committee. You know, Rich Rothstein and Rich Grassi and Jeff Berger, who was the chair at the time, and Paul Smith and Joe Coughlin, who serves with you as well. I mean, these people have a wealth of knowledge, and the things you're talking about that have been talked about for years, but now it's becoming a reality now. What worries you the most about the decommissioning?
My biggest concern about it is the inability for us to coordinate all of both the public people, the folks on the panel, along with opponents in the public, so beyond the panel, the actual public, along with the state, particularly the executive branch and the Attorney General's office, to get us all on exactly the same page with basically the same priorities over the next 4 months, because that's all we have left, to say to Holtec and to say to Entergy where it's appropriate, look, here are the things we need to have included in a memorandum of understanding. Now, we can intervene legally in this process. We can string out the process. We can delay it. But rather than doing that, rather than taking time and money on both sides, let's get together. And what I worry about is getting everybody on the same page to say, hey, let's sit down at the table and get this done. It's good business for them. They could make us their best reference or their worst enemy. And that's the best part of it now. But that's what I worry about. We've got a limited period of time now to get this done. And I worry about, let's get it done.
And I think in a lot of cases, and I know on your Citizens Advisory Panel, every branch of the government is, mass government is on it, except the AG's office.
Right.
And what I worry about that is that the learning curve to learn about this. States have not been involved, and it's not a criticism of this governor or past governors, it's just, it's been a federal thing. The NRC is actually really a separate entity. It does not report to the president or anybody else. They were formed that way. And so now we're trying to get our partners at the state level to try to get up to speed on something that has taken years for, at least for Vinny and myself and others to actually learn about. It's an overwhelming task.
It is, but I will tell you this, Representative. Because of the way that yourself, Senator DiMacedo, retired Senator Wolf, now Senator Sear, everybody from your colleague, Representative Peake out at the end of the Cape all the way up to Wynn, everybody is all on the same page. I would tell you that from what I've learned over the last year and a half, almost 2 years, the administration, Baker's administration, has done a great job of assembling the right people. I think Attorney General Healy's office now is fully engaged, and they appear to be doing a great job. It's now accelerating that. What we need to do is accelerate that focus and get the issues on the table, come to a reasonable agreement for both parties that in the best interest of the town of Plymouth, and we almost come full circle back on this conversation, back to the land. Well, the land is important to the town of Plymouth. The payments in lieu of taxes are important to the town of Plymouth. That doesn't matter quite so much down the Cape. It certainly doesn't matter that much on Beacon Hill.
Right. Nor do the jobs matter, the people on the Cape. But we can't forget about the people that are going to be losing jobs here in Plymouth.
It is our town.
Yeah.
And we have to fight for our town.
Yeah.
And that's why we've got to get everybody focused at the table and come to an agreement before this thing is closed.
Yeah, and it's almost a fine line that we're trying to walk, Vinny and I, that yes, it's about the Plymouth, town of Plymouth and the people in Plymouth and the folks are going to lose jobs, but we're trying to make the case that this affects everyone. And like you said, in the Commonwealth, and particularly this area in Cape Cod and South Shore. But it's like you said, trying to get people to understand all that by June 1st. It's a monumental task, but we're going to keep working at that. Yeah. Finally, in the couple of minutes we have left, what's your opinion how it's all going to play out for Plymouth and the surrounding communities over the next 50 years?
I'm very hopeful that we will not go through Safe Store, and that for the next 50 to 60 years, the dry cast, the spent material, won't be sitting a little further up on the hill off of Rocky Hill Road in dry cast storage, and that the buildings won't be there just getting gray and decrepit. I'm very hopeful that the whole tech approach will be worked out, and that the transaction, the actual transfer of the license and the property, will go to Holtec. There'll be sufficient funds in the $1 billion to clean it up, and that in 8, 7, 9 years, the site, with the exception of the dry cast storage, will basically be restored and clean, and that in a few years following that, it'll be moved off to an interim stand. So that's what I envision, and what I hope for. There's a lot of work to be done between now and then, and all of the other concerns that proponents, and I'm delighted that you mentioned the Nuclear Matters Committee, because part of the, quite frankly, the genius of you and Senator DiMacedo when you formed this committee, there are a core of us from Plymouth, many of whom spent hours and weeks and months and years.
You're experts, absolutely, yeah.
And they deserve our thanks and recognition for this. But the panel has that now.
Yeah, how often do you meet?
Every month, every Wednesday.
Every third Wednesday?
Every third Wednesday, and 6:30 to 8:30ish.
At PCIS.
So,
in Plymouth, off Exit 5, those watching from not from Plymouth, off Exit 5, right by past Home Depot.
We'd love to have you come by.
Well, thank you so much again for you leading this, and please express our appreciation to every single member of that commission. They've been doing some great work in a short period of time. But not only for on behalf of the town of Plymouth, we thank you, but also the Commonwealth for what you're doing. So
we wouldn't be here if it were not for you and Senator DiMacedo.
Thank you so much. We hope you enjoyed today's show and found it informative. I want to thank the folks here at PAC TV, especially Keith and Dave, for a terrific show and for all they do for our community to bring relevant stories and educational programs to our communities. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time on State Matters.